Oh man. Blair Witch. It's not good. In the team behind the Two Layers of Fears game's newest project, you play as a curious man named Ellis, out in the forest aiding a search team looking for a young boy named Peter, who's recently gone missing. Carrying his own traumatic baggage and a service dog to boot, Ellis plunges into the infamous Black Hills forest with nothing but a walkie-talkie, his trusty steed, and some delicious dog treats. The central mechanics of the game being, you guessed it, walking, just as in the rest of this team's games, but I found that now that it takes place in a mostly outdoor environment, there's a touch less of conveyance. Really, I only ended up getting a little lost in the very first opening section of the forest, and mechanically I sort of assumed Bullet was there to keep the player on track for the most part, and to keep the pace of the story going as you search along, but he's really just kind of a support character, I guess. Plenty of the time he just wasn't finding anything, or he would just lead me to the next bit of the game, as I assumed he was meant to do. You see, the problem with holding down a button and selecting a seek option from a menu in a forested environment is, where the hell am I supposed to search for stuff? There's so much terrain to cover some of the time that it's like, when is a proper time to use the command? I'm bound to pass over certain items and miss out on story bits the way this mechanic is used, unless it's really solely to keep the character on track. But I had a moment where Bullet brought me what I assume was a key story note. I mean, this problem is sort of problematic, because the linearity of the game's story pieces really tightens up after this first area, and it's mostly pretty easy to figure out where you're meant to go, especially with the addition of Bullet being with you almost always. Is that the path, buddy? Oh yeah, see? That's another f***ing thing. They can hide the paths behind a bunch of bullshit because you have to be like, where do I go, buddy? And then the dog's like, eh. Side note, very early on I felt like this game was just trying way too hard visually. Like, it sort of feels like it's going for an Outlast sort of look, and initially I was getting some frame rate drop with all the foliage and map design. Until after the first segment when the developers just kinda chilled on the woodsy bits and toned it back a little bit. The game was also patched on the first day, and after that my performance seemed to be mostly fine. Although the game is definitely trying too hard with what it's got and not nailing the look it wants to as well as it wants to. But hey, for the first time in this developer's games, we have fully rendered character cutscenes, with what seems like motion capture even. That was a nice touch that not a lot of horror games really do lately, especially indie ones. But your sins are not forgiven, Bloober. What starts off promising as a rampant search through the woods for a missing boy with the presence of an ever so haunting witch always hanging over your head quickly devolves into a nutcase cultist chase for a kidnapper, while the main character has flashbacks to his days in the military and as a police officer. I mean, I get it, and these sort of details could work to help flesh out a character and raise stakes, and maybe even mess with the head of your players, but ultimately what it comes down to when Bloober gets their hands on a mentally unstable protagonist is just confusion. They like to use this as an excuse to just make no sense and blur all the lines and bring out question after question without ever answering anything they're posing. Is Peter supposed to just be Ellis? Is Ellis also the kidnapper? Does Peter actually being die controlled at the end of the game, or was he actually found? Killed Peter? The one that was he the one that kidnapped Peter all along? He's also the one that calls the officer's wife, but nothing. Luckily, this game doesn't try to reach as hard as the aforementioned Layers of Fear series, or connect dots that are super far away with threads that don't exist, but nonetheless, what's going on here is nearly idiotic. Ellis becomes the Carver, this cultist, crazed man covered in mud and sticks, obsessing over the Blair Witch, and egging the protagonist on and on through his search to find Peter. In one ending, Ellis kills the Carver and looks into his reflection. Now he is the Carver. In another, he's just flat out killed by the Carver. A radio transmission says Peter is found walking on a street by the police. None of this is cohesive or even really engaging, and it's almost like the Blair Witch has nothing to do with this game beyond there being a camcorder to shoe in the found footage aspect. This game fumbles again and again and again in everything it tries to do. Cool reality manipulating mechanic that ties in with the camcorder thing, super simplified and handholdy because the game is too afraid to be any more complex with one of its only promising ideas and thinks its player base has the IQ of of a stone. Dangerous enemy that can be fought but also kill the player, super boring and uninteresting. It's fought with a flashlight, and the dog is how you tell where the thing is at. Every time the game shows a glint of promise to become more interesting and break the mold, it falls back into cliches and conventions that have been done a million times. The ability to look through the camera and use night vision is pretty cool. You can even hold it closer to the screen and use it instead of a flashlight. Hell, there's even a bit where you use a pseudo-thermal aspect of the camera, but as soon as the game's had its moment, it basically throws it away until it wants you to use it very specifically again. Sometimes you can just dump the flashlight altogether and use the night vision, but when you're holding the camera up to you, you can't go faster than a snail's pace, entirely canceling the idea of being able to use it in the first place in a meaningful fashion. The cell phone aspect is kind of cool too. You can look through contacts, make phone calls, change settings, silence the buttons, get text messages. You can actually call a key character's wife after you find him dead, but beyond that, it's really just used to get an achievement or two. Super underwhelming. The last 30 minutes of this game even managed to go layers of fear on the audience and loop you around a decrepit old house, presumably the one from the original movie. But aside from being a tiny bit of fan service, it only serves to allow you to interact with the sort of enemy variant that is the Carver, and bog down the entire pace of the story and limit exploration. I remember in the first maybe 5 minutes of this game, I stumbled upon a picture and said, "Oh, hey, look, that's from the movie. That's pretty cool. I hope they don't do that too many more times." And you know what they did? That. Like 50 more times. On top of all this, the story just doesn't make any sense. You know how I said earlier Peter gets found? I just figured out that's dependent on the ending you get. You see, there's a bunker pretty early on in the game that you can figure out how to get into, and once you have after a first or second playthrough, you can get a message that's something like this.
In other news, the search for a missing boy ends in tragedy. The body of 9-year-old Peter Shannon, who went missing in the Black Hills forest, was found near Coffin Rock.
And so the message I got after my first playthrough basically super implies that Ellis was the Carver the whole time, and he's the one that stabbed Peter and killed him. Get it? Sort of like when he stabs the Carver at the end, before he becomes the Carver? This game and the other Bloober games are something I'd call deep fake. They leave breadcrumb after breadcrumb, and typically just don't generally add up to much of anything when you try to look at the bigger picture. And with Layers of Fear 1 and 2, sure, this was kind of fun. Playing detective, sifting through the clues, but everything going on this time around is just so blatantly obvious, predictable, and on top of that, nonsensical. I shouldn't have to explain the fact that Ellis is interacting with the sheriff the way he is, and talking to the search party the way he is, and talking to Jess the way he is, basically outright says that none of this could even play out this way unless the game's intention is that we're looking through the eyes of a psychopath, through his fractured psyche, and experiencing a part of him in denial, creating a totally fabricated reality in front of him as to what? Confuse the player. That's what. And that's all. There could be depth to a protagonist like this. There could be a coherent way to play out a psychotic killer with a fractured psyche, and it's been done before. It's been done better too, and on top of that, ground like this has been covered time and time again. A great example is Jacob's Ladder. I mean, the whole damn movie is sort of an allegory to purgatory, PTSD, and the transition between life and death. Albeit not from the perspective of a deranged kidnapper murderer, but it's done so well. Like I said, this game is just bad. It falls flat on its face in every attempt it has whatsoever, and it bends its own rules to create a narrative that hangs loosely to its skeleton like a fucking scarecrow. It's poorly done, it looks rushed, it feels rushed, and its major story beats are diluted and half-assed. And for that, this game gets a
3 out of 10.